This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Thank you all very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I think that the issues that bring us here today, especially during this very tumultuous time, are among the most relevant that we have in our society. I know that I speak on behalf of this panel when I say that I'm very flattered to see the kind of turnout we have here this morning, especially when I realize that for the price of admission for $10, you could have bought controlling interest in any Wall Street financial firm or any bank in America. I'm Tom Brokaw of NBC News. I have an extended family attachment to Stanford. I didn't actually go here, and with good reason. I couldn't have met the high bar of Stanford admission. But I'm pleased to say that the next generation down, Jennifer Brokaw, class of 1988, celebrating until the wee hours this morning their 20th reunion, did go here, so I always say that I have an investment in Stanford. 4 years of tuition and fees, that's an investment at Stanford. We're going to begin by asking each of our panelists to describe for us within their area of expertise the culture of leadership. Leadership is not easily defined. It's not like a hard physics equation and X minus Y and you can come up with it. It really is very subjective. So we'll work our way through that today and try to make application. But we're going to begin, as we should, with the president of this great institution, John Hennessy. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. President, the theme here today is compassion, courage, and conviction. Do we think they're missing in society now?
Well, Tom, I would say the recent events on Wall Street really question whether or not we've lost character, and we've become so excited about the opportunity to make money and to focus on things other than the core integrity and values that we should have. I think it does call into question. I think courage is a difficult thing in times when there are hard questions to be faced up to. And I think they're both issues that we have more need for among young people.
If you have courage, conviction, and compassion, can you get into Stanford?
That and good grades, I think you're okay.
Let me ask you about what you've learned about leadership, going from the ranks, so to speak, now to the ivory tower of this very ivory tower institution. The Academy, obviously, is well known for having in the rank and file people who are independent thinkers. They're very curious about things, and they leave almost no premise unchallenged.
That's correct, and the first premise is, well, we really don't need a president. They're optional, and perhaps we could do without one. But I think what you tend to see is the difficulty of a complex institution, an institution where any decision that arrives at my desk will have people in the Stanford community, whether it's in the alumni community, the on-campus community, who divide over how that decision should be reached and what the final outcome should be. And unfortunately, you have to make those decisions. And there will be faculty or students that feel you shouldn't do that. When I became president, one of the things I thought about was it had been less than 100 years earlier that David Starr Jordan, our first president, had sat in the same chair and thought about the university and how the decisions he made preserved the flexibility and ability for Stanford to thrive and grow in excellence. And so you have a commitment to future generations, I think, that affects a lot of your decision making. And that's something that often people don't see inside the institution very clearly.
One of our panelists here today is a representative from Southern California, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, a graduate of Stanford class of 80, law school 1984, Xavier Becerra, who has the good fortune of representing a district that includes Chavez Ravine, the home of the Dodgers, who have to improve a little bit here in the next day or so. Let's talk a bit about leadership in the political arena, specifically in the Congress of the United States. In the last 2 weeks, have we seen the kind of leadership that we need in this country?
Tom, I think you have seen it in spurts, recognizing that we were told over the weekend of 2 weeks ago that we needed to infuse the financial services sector with $700 billion that we don't have. We just reported a $500 billion deficit. So trying to legislate in a panic never is a good prescription for success. And so you've seen efforts to try to stabilize, efforts to try to understand, and efforts to try to protect the interest of our investors, our shareholders, who are the taxpayers. So I think you've seen moments of leadership. I also believe that it's clear that there was a lack of leadership that let it get to the point where all of a sudden everyone in this room and everyone in this country was being asked to put on the table money that they did not expect to have to go to that use.
I want to talk, when we come back to you, about the more cosmic issues that might have been involved in these very difficult events as well in the last couple of weeks, about the crying need, the cry coming from the country about bipartisanship. So if you'll think about that. Another distinguished Stanford alum is Carly Fiorina, who's very familiar in this part of the world, obviously. As we walked by the library last night, she talked about doing her honors thesis there. Carly, you have served at the very highest levels of the new technology world in America as the CEO of Hewlett-Packard. You wrote a book called Tough Choices. You've been deeply involved with the John McCain campaign for President of the United States. And this is not a sexist comment, but is there a gender differentiation when it comes to leadership? Do women tend to see leadership in different ways and express it in a different fashion?
I actually think leadership is gender neutral. Let me explain by saying first what I think leadership is not. I don't think leadership is about title or position or power defined in traditional ways by maybe wealth or how many people report to you or how big your budgets are. I think leadership is about changing the order of things, making a positive difference. And I think good leaders, whether they are men or women, whether they are mothers who can lead or fathers who can lead or perhaps leaders with position, good leaders are communicative, whether they are men or women. They are collaborative, whether they are men or women. They are courageous and compassionate and have character and an internal compass, whether they are men or women. I think good leaders are authentic. And I think in particular, good leaders have things that we perhaps take for granted but are sorely missing right now in the financial crisis we've been talking about. Good leaders have common sense. They have good judgment, they have perspective, and they have the courage in particular to push back against conventional wisdom when that's required.
Jeff Raikes is another Stanford graduate. He was, as self-described, a Nebraska farm boy who came to Stanford and got a startling education in what advanced math really means, but at the end of 4 years prevailed, became a member of what I call the College of Cardinals at Microsoft in Redmond. He's been a member of the senior executive team there for a long time and has just taken over the CEO job at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There has been a transformation in this country that I think is quite profound in the last 20 years or so, and that is the emergence of the technologically oriented scientific class that has created this transformational technology. The brainiacs are in charge. Are the brainiacs different as leaders than the leaders that you were used to growing up?
Well, I think one of the things that I would point out is that a great part of the history of our country was an emphasis on science and technology and how it could improve the human condition. I think what you see in the last 20, 30, 40 years is an incredible growth in that potential. And as far as the leaders in that context, I would say that one of the great opportunities is for us to use the advances in science and technology to use the intellectual horsepower that's developed at Stanford and other great institutions to try and improve the human condition. I think that the key, though, is to put that in the context of people, to recognize that it's not only about the science and the technology, it's about how the technology or the science gets adopted. It's about how it can be used to actually improve the human condition. And I think that a key part of that is to have a very broad, focused view. So I think it's not only about the science and technology, I think it's about the broader aspects of that in the context of society.
Kavita Ramdas is the head of the Global Fund for Women and also an advisor to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Is there a differentiation culturally, regionally, politically between the concept of leadership? Take, for example, the idea of leadership on the subcontinent. Is it much different than it is in sub-Saharan Africa?
I think that there is, there are obviously profound cultural differences in lots of different ways between the different parts of the world that we live in, and even within the United States in different communities. What I'd say that really strikes me as different when you think about the United States at this moment of time in relationship to the rest of the world is somewhat of a differentiation between the understanding of leadership as being a characteristic of an individual and the notion of communities of leadership and the role of collective leadership. And I think that in a society that has perhaps for a while disproportionately tended to emphasize the individual, so Microsoft becomes Bill Gates, Apple becomes Steve Jobs, HP becomes Carly, you fail to remember that the profound underlying success of true leadership is recognizing that we don't lead by just one person at a time, that we lead in a collective endeavor, and that the best leaders are those who recognize that there are leaders all around them. I see that in the work of the Global Fund. I see that very directly in the work of the Global Fund for Women, and I think in our search for it's almost as though we've confused the notion of hero with leader. There are actually extraordinary leaders all around us. I saw them when I was working in public housing in Chicago, where there was welfare moms who were the only people who had the courage to challenge drug dealing in their neighborhoods, or whether I'm in the favelas of Brazil. So there is a notion of leadership that I think we can actually turn to at this moment, which is to suggest that instead of looking for someone to sort of ride in on a white horse and save us, we can look to this notion of a collective leadership. And I'll just end by saying that I've wondered whether, in fact, the ability for people, including women who've traditionally been left out of traditional structures of leadership, whether a parliamentary system actually makes it easier for people who have traditionally been left out to actually rise to positions of leadership than the system that you have in the United States, which is a presidential system in which you have to sort of have this kind of heroic figure of leadership that somehow is going to, represent everything that you hope for. I think in a parliamentary system, we have much more room for coming to consensus and agreement, or at least being willing to live in some degree of discomfort with people who have different ideas than you do.
Justice Anthony Kennedy of the United States Supreme Court, Stanford. I trust these are not all plaintiffs. Stanford class, law school, 1958. His son Greg graduated 20 years ago. He's here for his 20th reunion as well. I know you're not going to give up secrets of the inner sanctum here today. No one would expect that of you. But share with us, if you can, the characteristics of leadership in a small, intimate setting with people with a very high band, as they would say in the technology world, and very strong convictions about their field, and the difference, if there are any, between the characteristics of leadership in that kind of a setting and the characteristics that you would see in a much larger arena.
Well, we are fortunate in that we live within a very formal structure. We must reach certain issues. We must decide. We don't have the luxury of not deciding. On the other hand, we decide a rather smaller universe of issues. And to do that, we have a tradition, a decorum, an etiquette, a chronology, a timeline, a language, a grammar that's different than the dialogue in the political branches, different than the dialogue in public. Not better, not worse, but different. And within this language of the law, we must try to define leadership in a way to fulfill the law's purposes. The law lives in the consciousness of the people. And the justices must remember that they are just brief trustees of a legal tradition and of a constitutional tradition that must be transmitted to the next generation. And I think of myself primarily as a teacher, like Professor Kennedy. Sometimes students will ask, are you nervous when you go to an oral argument and the attorneys are arguing? And your temptation is to think of the professor who says, oh, it's as hard to give the exam as it is to take it. Don't believe it. I love oral argument. It's easy. I do get nervous when I go into our conference room. Yesterday morning, each of us had to argue 6 cases and try to convince our colleagues. And it's a wonderful dynamic because, as I say, we have this formal language. We are fortunate that we have a high degree of command and control. In many courts in the world, in Russia, if a court decides that certain tax is illegal, they're out collecting it the next day. We don't do that. We have a high degree of command and control. But that's because we have the confidence of the people. And when we're in that conference room and we're taking a position on close cases, some of which are 5-4, if you're on the side that prevailed with 5 or more votes, there are not a lot of back slaps and high fives and thumbs up. There's a moment of awe and quiet as we realize that we are judged by the reasons that we give, and that one of us has to write an opinion that commands the allegiance of the people. We don't have a press corps, we don't have PR guys, we don't go around giving speeches saying how great my opinion was last week or how bad the majority was. We're judged just on what we do and what we write. But we do have to teach. And one thing we must teach is the American constitutional tradition, which defines us as a people. And of course, I'm concerned that this teaching is a conscious act. You don't take a DNA test to see if you believe in freedom. It's taught. And teaching is a conscious act, as the professor knows. And you can't understand what you haven't learned. You can't transmit to the next generation. You can't transmit what you do not revere. And you can't defend what you do not know. And that's our position.
And as we wrap up this phase of our discussion and exposition of the culture of leadership, we turn to preeminent historian David Kennedy, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for what I think is one of the best books in my lifetime. And if you want to know about now, you should read it. Freedom from Fear, 1928 to 1945. History does have a way of looking itself in the mirror and repeating itself. David, 2 things, if I may. One, again, you and I were children of the 50s in a way, and leaders had more mythical qualities because we knew less about them. They didn't get the kind of exposure that they get now. Good thing or bad thing? 2, do we have a kind of rose-colored rearview mirror when we think about leaders looking back? When people say to me, where are the great leaders now that we used to have then?
Well, Tom, on your first point, actually there's quite an impressive body of polling data about people's faith in institutions and leaders and authority figures and so on. from the 1950s to the present, and the data are rather sobering because the American people's confidence in leaders and institutions has dropped off precipitously beginning in the 1960s. And whether that's because of the perceived failure of institutions and failure of leaders, or because of, you'll forgive me, media saturation and the coverage of such things, is anybody's guess. But the fact is we trust our leaders today, and I don't mean just this year, but for the last generation, we trust them less than we did in the era in which we were growing up. But you know, this concept of leadership is extremely elusive, and I'm tempted to say, and I believe I'm going to yield to the temptation, taking a leaf from Justice Potter Stewart's book, that leadership has some things in common with pornography. It's very difficult to define, but we know it when we see it.
I was saving that line for later, actually, and I'm furious with you that you stole a beat on it.
Well, more importantly, and here I realize I'm stretching the definition of pornography, but I think there's a second thing that leadership possibly has more or less in comparison with the pornography, and this is an important point, and I think Kavita made it, and so did Carly, that leadership consists in a relationship between consenting adults. That it is a relationship at bottom. It's not simply a function exercised by an individual or an institution. Leaders must have followers or other leaders in their embrace. And without that relationship, I think there is no effective leadership. And yes, to go to your second question, we do have in our historical canon, I think, some examples of truly effective and admirable leadership. Abraham Lincoln is an obvious example. I believe, Justice Kennedy and I were talking about this just before we came in, that Franklin Roosevelt in 1940-41, when he had to persuade this reluctant isolationist country to put its weight in the scales in the event that we know was World War II, that was a really dramatic moment of truly effective leadership.
Congressman, in the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives, how much time do you set aside for the concept that we're talking about here today and more overarching approaches to the problems of the day, or are you consumed by just getting through the next 24 hours and moving a bill from a subcommittee to a committee to the floor?
Remarkably, what you find is that there is a core group of leaders that the speaker surrounds herself with who on a daily basis are talking. It's impossible to gather 435 members on a daily basis. But these last 2 weeks, on a hourly basis, we were getting updates from the speaker on when we would come together as part of this leadership team to discuss this crisis. And so you actually find that there is far more conversation going on between your colleagues than some people would suspect. But Tom, I hope at some point we diverge a bit. Times change, but I don't believe the DNA of leadership changes a whole lot. Courage, transparency, what I would call ganas, which from Spanish to English translates best into passion, hunger. And I think what we're finding is that beyond the definition of leadership is the issue of, do we really understand this new world of the 21st century that we're asked to lead? And perhaps more to the point, do we actually understand who we are in America today? And I would submit to you, Tom, that too often the people we call leaders in this country don't even know the people that they believe that they're leading very well. And I believe we have to get to the point of cracking that nut open, because until we understand ourselves, we're going to fail at understanding the world. If I were to tell you that $1 spent today on weapons of the world could do a great deal to help children, I would only need to ask you for 1 penny of that dollar to make sure that all the unschooled children in the world, some 120 million, could actually go to a classroom on a day-to-day basis. 1 penny of the $1 we spend on an annual basis for weapons in this world. I don't think most leaders in America understand what type of investment it would take to make sure that child is carrying a book instead of a weapon, which may at some point be pointed against us. And so my point, and I hope where America takes this conversation about leadership, is really, do we understand what we're being asked to do by a whole new generation of people that look far different from the previous generation of leaders that we had in this country?
Well, let's ask Carly Fiorina about that, because she's now lived in both worlds. She's been intensely in the political world, working with the McCain campaign, came out of the corporate world, spent a lot of time in academia. Before that was with AT&T, a very ordered corporate organization. Tell us about what it was like to be at the vortex of a presidential campaign and the decisions that had to be made every nanosecond, and the influences that were exerted on that campaign by us, now in this 24/7 cycle, by the campaign consultants, by the people who are out there, for example, in Pennsylvania saying, you've got to come here, or in Florida say, you've got to address that. How difficult is it for leadership to emerge in this kind of a superheated environment?
Well, I think, I mentioned the word perspective before, and I think it's always difficult to find and retain perspective in a superheated, supercharged environment. What is perspective? Perspective is the ability to step back and see the forest for the trees. Perspective is the ability to stop and pause instead of acting. And it's difficult to gain perspective in a business setting. I think we lacked some perspective leading up to the financial crisis, and it's difficult to find or retain perspective in a political setting. Politics is a nasty business, and it's easy to get cynical about politics, whether you're far away from it, observing it as a voter and watching you on television, or being with you on television and getting asked a bunch of tough questions, or whether you're in the middle of the campaign. It's easy to be cynical. And I'll tell you the thing that has happened to me in the course of this that I did not expect to happen. I am cynical when I look at campaigns. I'm cynical when I listen to pundits. I'm cynical when I watch 24-hour cable news. But I am inspired when I go out and talk to Americans all over this country. Because what you find when you go out and talk with people is that people understand the issues that are impacting their lives. They don't understand all the intricacies of everything, but they understand how it's impacting them. They understand that these are important choices. They understand whatever their politics are, however they are going to vote. They understand how they are going to make that decision. And so I have found in the course of this last 18 months, and it sounds so corny, but it's really true. Back to Justice Kennedy's comments, I have been more impressed than ever before with the wisdom of our founding fathers. It turns out that common sense isn't so common, but it turns out that ordinary people have a lot of common sense and good judgment and perspective when they need it. So I found it inspiring in an unexpected way.
Justice Kennedy, when you get home at the end of the day, you've spent most of your day in a contemplative culture, and you've had very bright young people around you as your clerks and your colleagues at the highest level, dealing with the lasting issues that come before the court. When you go home at the end of the day and you're a citizen, and if you do watch the news, or you're reading the newspaper and you're seeing what is going on, how struck are you by the intensity, the bombardment, if you will now, of criticism and sensationalism and exploitation, for that matter, of every perceived weakness that is going on?
Well, as I've indicated, we live in this formal little world, not a part of the general public discourse. And so I have to be careful not to diminish it. When Carly was speaking, it reminded me of a meeting I had at the United Nations with some leaders on the condition of the poor around the world. And this was about 8 months ago. And from New Zealand, Australia, the Sub-Sahara, India, the leaders were all saying how impressed they were with the primaries. At that time, it was the fight between Clinton and Obama, and then with McCain and his challengers. They said, we've learned to love America again. From what I see, it looks, democracy is hurly-burly. Democracy is not a neat thing, never has been. Democracy is very old in theory, very old in theory, ancient times Greece. It wasn't implemented until a modern era. And it was implemented and theorized we haven't learned to live with the mass media. The mass media hasn't learned to live with democracy with the mass media. We haven't found the right balance. And it's not necessarily the media's fault either. There's an interdependence insofar as information and dialogue. But I agree with Carly. Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government, other than every other form of government. And this is revealing itself. But we must be on our guard. The verdict is out. There's a doubting world. More than half of the world is not yet ready to commit that democracy is the best system of government. And it's our challenge, and it's the duty of this generation to make the case.
Kavita, would you like to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to say I think it makes it extremely difficult to make the case when a system of government that is so fundamentally premised on consenting adults and equal participation and equal dignity and respect is forced using weapons, using military might, using advanced technological powers, using the realities of a world that truly have not been a very fair world, not for the vast majority of human beings who live on this planet for the last 500 years. So I think the experience of trying to share the possibilities of democracy as a way in which to truly enable full and free participation, whether it is for women, whether it is for minority communities, whether it is for people of any religion or non-religion, for that matter, to participate and be truly heard, requires a degree of humility, I think, in our own understanding of what it means to be a leader for this project, if indeed it is a project. And that, I think, is going to take some very different conception of not only the role of the United States, but I would say for much of the Western world, to really regain the credibility that I think it has so severely lost in much of the rest of the world.
President. President Hennessy, I suppose if there's a cliched characterization of the current generation is that it's self-absorbed, it thinks that life can be found in text messaging, and that the greatest pursuit of happiness is to pile up a big fortune, and by the way, high entertainment is what did Paris Hilton do just last night? Based on the students that you see coming through Stanford, and you'll have to forgive me, I had a daughter who went there, at that other institution across the bay at UC Berkeley. All right, I'll go ahead and do it. We had a daughter here and a daughter at Berkeley, and I went to Berkeley and I made a small speech that has followed me forever whenever I come to Stanford, in which I said, I know what it's like to have one daughter at Berkeley and one daughter at Stanford. It's like having one who's a member of the Grateful Dead and the other one who's a member of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And Don Kennedy arranged to have a premium attached to my tuition payments after that. But at these great institutions across America, Berkeley, Stanford, UC Davis, and the other institutions here throughout America, the students who are coming now in the 21st century do they have that same kind of charge that a lot of us who came out of the 50s, raised by the greatest generation, if you'll permit me that, felt this obligation because our parents were such role models for us to do something larger than who we were?
Actually, Tom, I am more optimistic about the current generation of students than I've been in many years.
Yeah.
They are. They are energetic. They're committed to making a difference. They have a different approach. You know, I'm a child of the Vietnam War era. Our approach was government and authority, that's the enemy. They see the world as a much more global place. They've traveled much more. They spent more time abroad. They're living now on a campus that looks like a microcosm of America. It's not just students from a very traditional background. It's students from a whole range of backgrounds, rural, inner city, and of course, an entire ethnic palette as well. They're approaching things completely differently. I look at our enrollment in our teacher education program, which is at record levels. These are young people that want to go out, people from Stanford who are going to take a salary far lower than they could earn in many other roles in society, and they're going to work with young people to try and help them teach and learn. It's that kind of excitement, that kind of enthusiasm. We're going to go solve the environmental problems of the world. We're going to go work on the hard things. We're going to work on the developing world. We're going to participate in a course that tries to design products that will help people in the developing world, as opposed to focusing on just the next new thing for our society.
David, I want to ask you a question, and it's a setup, if you will, Congressman, for you. You and I have talked a lot about the 60s and the consequences of the 60s. This election, in many ways, is consequential because of the 60s. We have an African American at the head of the ticket. We have a woman on the other ticket. That all grew out of the 1960s. There was healthy skepticism. The pendulum swung too far in many instances. But one of the residual effects of the 1960s is, in the political arena, there became this mantra that the personal is political. And therefore, I worry about what is personally important to me. And as a result of that, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, as a result of that, we lost connective tissue in many ways. People would go to Washington and worry only about choice or pro-life. Or they'd go to Washington and they'd worry only about their position on guns, and they didn't care about other things. Have we begun to work our way out of that, which it seems to me in some ways made our political arena less effective? And that's what I want to ask Congressman Becerra. It made it harder for people to be leaders because they constantly were paying homage to these special interest groups, well-financed, well-organized, and had targets of opportunity every day.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think we've seen, or we did see for a generation after the 1960s, a rather decided and studied and maybe even purposeful fragmentation of the array of political issues that made it into the public arena and made the public square that much more contentious a place. And you've just named some of them: abortion, all kinds of issues, the so-called social issues have that character. They're difficult to reconcile politically. There's very little room for compromise, and that's why so many of these issues end up not being solved by legislatures and the Congress, but go to the courts, because the polity cannot find common ground. So I think that's an absolutely salient characteristic of the era since the 60s. And I think you're right. I think many people detect that this election may bring some kind of cadence to the evolution of that era. We may be ready for a transformation where we once again begin to repopulate the public square with people who are willing to compromise with one another.
Congressman, how much do you have to deal with that on a daily basis? These highly organized interest groups that are focused on one issue, and that's their litmus test for you.
If you're asking on a daily basis, then it's on an hourly basis. And I think that's one of our problems. We're in this rut where certain issues, which are very important to demographics in this country, whether it's the issue of abortion or guns, somehow seems to mask the real issues that I believe really should dominate the debate. We're a country that is principally monolingual, yet there are 149 languages that are spoken in America. Everyone has heard this statistic before because of the energy crisis. We are home to about 4.5% of the world's population, 3% of the world's oil reserves, and we consume 25% of the world's oil. Meanwhile, we have conversations about whether Washington, D.C. should be allowed to have a law, an ordinance to permit some type of gun control. I would submit to you that most people throughout the world would prefer to know what we're going to do with the guns that are out proliferating in the world than they want to know how we're going to fight the battle of gun control or let me keep my gun under the Second Amendment. And until we begin to focus on that grander scale, because we are still the preeminent leader in the world, we're not going to get to the point of really bringing along all those people who wish to follow our lead.
Jeff, you have a very well-defined but very large agenda at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in terms of what you want to do overseas, the end of poverty, the end of malaria, programs that are larger than many government efforts have been historically. But as I've heard Bill talk about it, and Melinda talk about it as well, they have, if you will, just below that, a subtext, which is to create what they call creative capitalism, to make that part of the capitalistic ethos. In doing that, are they going to change forever, in your judgment, or is it the goal to change forever about how we think of the role of capitalism and private industry in addressing social issues and raising it, if you will, to an institutional factor that will live forever?
Well, Tom, before I get to that, I'm still thinking about your daughters and Berkeley and Stanford and Grateful Dead and Mormon You didn't explain which was which.
I didn't say which was which, by the way, Jeff. I left it to you. And if you settled on Stanford and the Grateful Dead, that's fine.
That's good. That's media taking leadership here. I want to actually bridge from the Congressman Becerra and the conversation there, because into the question that you asked, I really, really think that we are at a time where what we need in the 21st century in terms of leadership are leaders who will look at the current challenges as the opportunity to bring people together. You know, that's one of the things that, you know, building on David Kennedy's comments, one of the things that we've seen is just too much divisiveness. And actually, as sad as the current situation is, I think it's an incredible opportunity to bring people together. Now, to your point about the Gates Foundation and the concept of creative capitalism, I actually see there as a synergy in that concept. The Gates Foundation, while large, is actually a very, very, very small percentage of the investment that needs to be made in improving society. And the only way the Gates Foundation can play a substantive, successful role is to engage in great work with partners. And that's part of leadership, to be a catalyst, to bring people together. Creative capitalism is a concept that can build on the successes that can occur in a market economy and bring that to the improvement of the social condition. So I'm trying to thread together some important concepts here. It's a time where we need to think of the challenges as an important opportunity to bring people together. And in order to succeed, we're going to have to advance the state of the art. We're going to have to think of the capitalist economy as something that can contribute to these improvements in the human condition, the improvements in society, and do that in a way that will magnify the impact by bringing together all of our resources, by looking at the challenge as the opportunity.
Kavita, in the Global Fund for Women, do you always see yourself as disconnected from traditional government organizations? And this is plainly an expanding universe out there, the role of the NGOs. And does that make it possible for you to be more effective given where you work if there is no government attachment?
I believe that the role of what is often referred to as the nonprofit sector, that I like to think of as the for-profit sector with regard to social profit. I think we're also about profit, but we're about profiting the public good in some sense, as opposed to private good. I think there's always been a role for that sector, and de Tocqueville, coming to the United States years ago, was most struck by the citizen-led associations that he saw, proliferating around this country. I think that, to me, goes back to our larger question about what is real democracy. Democracy is not about holding elections. Democracy is about having a set of institutions, including an active, organized, mobilized citizen sector that has voice, that can hold both private sector and government accountable. And when I think about the work that we do, and when I think about the work of whether it's philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation or many of the grassroots organizations that the Global Fund for Women supports in 167 countries, it is their ability to hold these other institutions' feet to the fire and to expect excellence of them, to demand that democracy is more than just elections. It is when a group of citizens in India challenge the impunity with which the government of Gujarat could conduct essentially ethnic cleansing of Muslims in February of 2006 after a Godhra incident. That is when you're really beginning to see democracy at work, because common citizens are not only taking the initiative to address challenges in their own communities, but are also expecting the highest standards from government. So I'm not a believer in sort of the privatization. I think in the privatization of everything to the nonprofit sector. I believe there is an important role for government. I believe there's an important role for the private sector, but that citizens must have a space that is their own, in which they can hold those two sectors accountable.
Justice Kennedy, can leaders become great leaders without the rule of law, without a strong tradition codified and understood by the populace if they don't have the rule of law behind them?
Well, as I've indicated, the verdict is out on the rule of law, and it's difficult to improve the human condition, which is what Jeff and Ms. Ramdas have been talking about, without some assurance that there's no corruption, that there's a voice of the people that are being listened to. You mentioned the term pursuit of happiness. It's interesting. That was a Jeffersonian term in the Declaration of Independence. That word comes down to us with a hedonistic or a self-gratification context that it really didn't have in those times. To the framers, to the founders, the idea of happiness was that feeling of self-esteem and that self-integrity you have from contributing to your society. And these young people that you talk about, President Hennessy, and I've taught night law school for nights and in summer for about 30 years. I agree with you. I see in this generation of young people an altruism, a moderation, a civic commitment, a decency that I haven't seen in 35 years of teaching. Mm-hmm. And what they are beginning to understand, is that our best security is in the world of ideas, and the world of ideas must be concerned with the human condition. Look at, Jeff and Carly and Ms. Ramdas work in this area all the time. It's not my area. There are 6 billion people on this earth of humankind. Over 2 billion do not have adequate drinking water. I was talking to Jeff last night. How many hours, and you can't call it man hours because it's woman's work, how many hours a year are spent in the sub-Sahara bringing water to the family? Answer, 16 billion with a B, and that's the lowest estimate. For some people, it's 6 to 8 hours a day to get water for their family. You take a picture in the sub-Sahara of that elegant, stately African woman with the long collared dress and the water jug on her head. That weighs more than the luggage allowance at the airport.
Yep. Yep.
And this is the thing that the young, and you look at, The temptation for the rule of law is to say, oh, well, you have a Magna Carta and you wait 600 years. And then you have a revolution, then you have a civil war. I think it was a Ford Foundation report quoted Martin Luther King. We have to realize the fierce urgency of now. These people cannot and will not wait, and they should not.
Which is the perfect prologue to what I want to ask David about next, because I have detected, and it's not just out there in the ether, people are beginning to talk about this, about where we go from here and finding leadership and the conflict, if you will, between imperfect democracy and pretty good stability that is not democracy. If you take, for example, Zimbabwe, it's a democracy. Russia is a democracy. Venezuela is a democracy. China is not. Are the leaders of China great leaders because they don't have democracy, but in many ways they're providing their people with what they need?
Well, you remind me, and Justice Kennedy's remarks remind me of a line from Antigone, where Creon, the king, says that without order, there is no such thing as family or friendships even. That order is essential, stability is essential to the formation of other elements of civic culture and their evolution and growth. So you can call it the rule of law or order. I think they're reasonably synonymous. So I think that's absolutely essential. But I don't think it's the end point of human or social evolution, which is why I and others hope and expect that China will evolve in a direction that does allow for more citizen participation and the cultivation of those kinds of, I use the word again, relationships that I think are the essence of the leadership function. But we talk about these globally scaled problems, as Justice Kennedy just so eloquently has done, and Kavita as well. And it reminds me, or makes me think, that we're emerging into an era when the whole concept of leadership is bursting national boundaries, taking on global dimensions on a scale that the world really hasn't seen before. Issues down to the level of potable water in Africa and so on. The nation is best positioned still, even in this compromised day of ours, to exercise a leadership function in this troubled world of ours still remains the United States. And I think again of how many times in this conversation, when we're talking about leadership at whatever level, personal, Supreme Court, in our families, in our nation, words like credibility, trust, authority, confidence keep recycling. And I'm thinking that for our country, the first order of business as we face the rest of the planet in this coming generation is to reestablish our credibility. There's a phrase that I'm thinking of, comes from a book by Bert Decker written over a decade ago. He did a turn on the phrase about it has to be heard to be believed. And he said you have to be believed to be heard. And I think this is a very important mission for our country going forward, is to be believed again in the world as a country that does practice what it professes.
Jeff,
But China doesn't have the rule of law.
And picking up on that for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and you're the man with your hand on the tiller now and steering it in that direction. Describe for us, if you will, the order of priorities on the subjects that David was just talking about. When you go, especially to Africa, but around the world, in Asia and other places, do you have to kind of lower your American profile and have a far greater awareness of the culture that you're living in and dealing with? And does that become part of the template that you're trying to establish as well?
Yeah, Tom, that's absolutely critical. And in fact, I had a great discussion with Kavita before we came on stage, which helped me to really emphasize the importance of understanding the context in which these innovations in science and technology and approaches, they won't take hold unless you can really understand the culture, the environment. And that includes governance issues. I think it's possible to invest an incredible amount in trying to produce social profit to try and advance the human condition and find that it gets totally destroyed by a weak governance system. I think it's possible to produce a brilliant vaccine, but understand that you don't have the way to get it to the children who need that in order to save their lives. And so I think it requires deep understanding of the country, the culture, the environment in which you're trying to make a positive advance. The only way to succeed then is to have that sense of humility and to feel that and understand that in order to succeed in the mission, what you're really doing is you're working as partners with the organizations, the grantees, the NGOs, to ultimately serve the people who we can really help.
And how important is it for you to have a popular understanding in this country about the efficacy of the work that you're doing abroad? I say that in part because both Bill and Melinda have said to me, look, there are so many more good stories than are reaching the American public, and a big and important part of our mission going forward is to raise the consciousness of everyone about the importance of this and the benefits of it, for that matter.
Well, it's extremely important for at least two reasons. One is that a very important part of us succeeding with the aspirations that we have on the foundation is to in part be a catalyst with others to try and accomplish the good work around the world. It's very, very clear we cannot do it alone. That is symbolic of what was said earlier about the current American profile in this world. This country has to understand it cannot succeed by going it alone. And that's also true when it comes to trying to improve the human condition. So it's very important for that reason. Another reason it's so important actually ties back to what President Hennessy and others were saying about students as they enter into the world. I absolutely agree with what was said about their interest in the world and their desire to make a difference. And a key part of why that's happening is because they are getting connected with what is really going on in sub-Saharan Africa or India or China. You know, technology and the advances that have been made in the way in which it impacts the media is certainly far from perfect, but one of the great things is that it's really opened up our eyes. It's opened up the eyes of this new generation so that they can be excited about what it is that they can do to make a difference in the world, whether it be in their local community or it be a community 12 time zones away. And I think that's exciting. And so we have to get those stories out. We have to give them that sense of the opportunity to make a difference. And I see the passion there. I see the energy there. I see the horsepower. It's about getting that connected to this opportunity, and getting the stories out will give them a vision of how they can make a difference.
I hesitate to open this box because it's now 7 against me. But President Hennessy, if you had a magic wand and you were the kind of magna editor-in-chief, how would you change the way news is reported these days with its much wider screen and many more component parts?
Well, Tom, let me first say that the free press is a critical aspect of development and democracy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think all the evidence we have about how to help people around the world move forward says that issues of the rule of law, as the Justice mentioned, and a free press are as important, if not more important, than a democratic election process. So the first thing is we need that. Now, I think if we'd all have a complaint, I think we'd say that in this world of the quick clip and the 30-second interview and the quick verbal spot, that the press has gotten increasingly shallow. Obviously, some of it under the financial pressures of an advertising world that's changed considerably. And I think it's made it very difficult to really understand the complexity of the world we live in. And we live in a far more complex world than we lived in before, far more interconnected, far more global. And what happens around the world impacts all of us. And that's something we have to keep in mind, and the press has to help us, serve us in that way.
Kelly, tell us about the prism through which you saw the press during your experience with the McCain campaign. You can exclude your appearance on Meet the Press. You don't have to go there.
Well, before I do that, I want to just go back to a previous question that you asked me, because I've been thinking a lot about it listening to this conversation. You asked me whether leadership was different between men and women, and my answer was no. But I would also tell you that we will not solve the many problems or address the many opportunities that we all see unless there are more women leaders. And why? I mean, if you think about this country just in a political context, 54% of the voting public is women. Women start small businesses at twice the rate of men. Small business is the economic engine. If you go around the world, you know that women as leaders in their families are frequently the only source of leadership in communities. And rule of law is in particular important because many, many women have no recourse when they are brutalized. So we need more women leaders all over the world. It's one of the reasons I started something called One Woman Initiative, which is focused on empowering women in various parts of the world. Now to your question. I think that I agree completely with President Hennessy that the press has become, in general, superficial. And it's not because people aren't interested in substantive issues. It's part of what I was trying to say before when I indicated that I'm inspired when I go out and talk to people. People are interested in substantive issues, and there are provocative, entertaining, memorable ways to talk about substantive issues if you talk about those issues through people's life stories. But I guess I would say one other thing as well. The press in this country is proud of their role in giving the public what they need to know. In other words, I think that impetus comes from a very necessary and very worthy goal to create transparency and demand accountability. I think in some ways that has turned into a desire to see perfection in people. People are not perfect. People will make mistakes. And I think the press fixates on the imperfections of people, and we are all imperfect.
There's an expression that we don't share very often, but it's familiar in my fraternity, in my generation of the press at least, is that we're great at throwing a punch, but when one is thrown at us, we have glass jaws. We go down with the first
Well, I
whip.
would say the press is among the most thin-skinned people I've ever met.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with that more. But may I offer a lowercase rebuttal?
See, you always have to.
No, a wider context, because I have thought about this a great deal. I do think that there's far too much temptation on the part of the press in this more frenzied environment in which we live to pronounce someone guilty the moment that they step into the public arena, whatever their motivations may be, whatever their background may be. It is to say there must be something wrong with them. Why would they be running for public office? I think that has become. I think that's become a judgment that is too easily exercised. Here's the part of it that I think is serious. All of us have a role in this. We have to be more energetic as readers and as viewers. There's an enormous amount of material out there that wasn't there before. I can access his website. I can get congressional records. I can get detailed explanations on the website that the New York Times puts out, or the Wall Street Journal, or the Financial Times, if I'm living in the most rural hamlet in America, in great detail at 7 o'clock in the morning on my small screen. But I have an obligation as a citizen, if I want to be well informed, to work at that and not just go to Entertainment Tonight or watch just the frenzied stuff that goes on MSNBC or on the Fox News channel.
And by the way, one of the reasons that I find it inspiring to be out there is a lot of people do exactly that. It's one of the reasons a lot of people work at being informed. I frankly find it, I'm not speaking of you obviously, but I find it stunning the disdain with which many reporters hold the people they are supposedly reporting for. People are smart, and people will find the information that they think is relevant to them, and people have a pretty good screen, a pretty good way of determining what's just entertaining junk and what's really relevant and substantive.
David, you're a student of American history in the last 70 years. In the broadest possible context, has the press made it more difficult for leaders to emerge than they did when Roosevelt was being vilified by the Los Angeles Times, for example, or the Chicago Tribune?
Well, certainly for the reason you said earlier about the personal becoming the political, the personal and private lives of public figures have become much fairer game for reportage than they were once upon a time. And yeah, I think that somehow raises the bar of difficulty or anxiety or hesitation that one might have about stepping into the public arena. But I want to demur a little bit from what Carly just said. I think we may need to make some distinctions among the media. And I think it's quite remarkable how much really first-class journalism there is in this country. Some of it's on television. A lot of it is in the newspaper press. And you think of these large, really serious news organizations like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times. These are serious enterprises, and they're led by and large, I think, by very high-minded and committed people. And the ethos and the DNA of the people that work in those organizations is to get the story right and to serve the public interest by factual reporting. So we live in hard times for newspapers for the reasons that have already been recited. And I think it's particularly alarming, as John Hennessy said, that in a world that is globalizing at an exponential rate, American newspapers in particular are shutting down their foreign bureaus. So we're actually impoverishing ourselves in terms of understanding and being informed about the world that is developing all around us. But I do think that there's something to be quite positive to be said about American journalism at its best.
Yeah.
May I say, as a feminist, I have to say something about the whole issue about personal is political. First of all, it was a call of the feminist movement, and I think it goes back to some of the conversations we've just been having. There is a reason when an entire section of population, 54% of the voting population, more than 51% of the world's population, is systematically excluded from every significant decision-making process, and it starts with your own body and goes on from there into the family, into the world, the community. That the feminist thinkers who coined that phrase, the personal is political, chose that explicitly to explain that the experience of being disempowered, the experience of being disenfranchised, the experience of having no voice is one that can politicize you with a small p in the best possible sense, can mobilize you, can have you be a part of the rest of society in a world that has essentially made public space for women something that has been taboo for not just 100 years, but for millennia. So I just want us to be clear about where that phrase came from and use it not just to somehow suggest special interest groups, but to remember where it came from and to remember how important it is for many other constituencies around the world as you struggle for self-determination.
I couldn't agree with you more about the origins of it and the importance of the origins of it. The problem is, like so many other phrases and the central truths of where something comes from, it gets picked up and exploited, and in many ways, it then becomes kind of cancerous to the public. President Hennessy, part of what we're talking about here today is character. What is the obligation of a university to form character?
You know, this is a question I'm often asked on Parents' Weekend when parents want to know how we're going to form the character of their young sons and daughters. The first thing I always say is, what you have already done in raising them is far more than we can do. We can expose them to different views, different perspectives, and I think for so many of our students coming here, they meet somebody who comes from a different part of the world. They meet somebody who comes from a different ethnic background, and all their prejudices are challenged all of a sudden. And they find out that certain assumptions they would make about people are not the assumptions that are really true. I think that helps them form character as they go forward and think about what leadership role they might be in the future. I think that one of the things I think I'm very passionate about is the role of teaching history. From history, we learn great lessons. I think we've seen one of that lessons play out in the last few years. If you go back to the greatest generation, I think those of us that had parents that were alive at that time, we knew the struggle that the country went through. We know how much our parents sacrificed as they lived through the Depression and the Second World War. A leader who gets up and says, well, we can fight a war, and there's no financial sacrifice, there's no personal sacrifice required for most Americans, is misleading us and doing a disservice to the young people.
Justice Kennedy, you have a rare insight into the best and brightest of generations as they evolve. Since you've been on the course since 1988, you've had clerks. Has there been any significant change in the fundamental character DNA and compassion and courage and feeling that these clerks that have come through the High Court since you've been there, even on a minute basis?
I don't want to overstate it, but I do think what I said before is that this new generation has a scope of outlook, a universal concern that I did not see earlier. I want to just say a few things in this connection. One other thing about rule of law. I'm not going to give you my rule of law lecture. You can come back for that sometime. I go to China often to teach, and I was giving a big lecture at Renmin, which is downtown. And the Chinese government said, you know, last week we just passed the rule of law. We have the rule of law now. I said, well, that's very good. And you know, the term is really insufficient even in English. I mean, in a sense, Hitler had a rule of law. If you were Jewish, you had to wear the yellow star. That's not what we mean by the rule of law. And China tells you they have the rule of law. They don't. Because the rule of law presumes a respect for human dignity, a respect for equality, a respect for laws that are available to the people and can be enforced without penalty, a respect for laws to hold the government to account. With reference to the press, when I go to China, I say, you know, China's very concerned just about managing its country. China's $1.3 billion. If you forget the billion, the 300 million makes them the second largest country in the world. They're the second largest country in the world without the billion. So they have a command and control management problem. And I said, well, you know what we have in the United States? I said, we have auditors in every small village, every small city. They watch government officials, they report, and they're free. And they say, oh, I tell you, they're called the press. And this is what we have in the United States to give us this information. And these young people that are coming to us currently are able to come to grips with this great knowledge that you've discussed, what you can see on your screen at 7 in the morning. You know, I should tell you it's your business, but it used to be that the press was rather vertical. The reporter got the story, the producer helped refine it, the editor checked it. Now it's horizontal. You get information from the blog, from the cosmic web, whatever you call it. The press has a new role, and that's to help us to distill and to synthesize this information. The press does a very good job, with reference to the court, of reporting what we did. They don't do a very good job of why we did it or why we should do it. These young people that come to us are willing to confront this difficult challenge. And part of character is the commitment to have a long-term view of how we can help shape the destiny of our own time. And these young people are capable of doing that.
In the moments that we have left, what I'd like to do is go to each of you and ask the leader that you often think of when you think of leadership, and the one or two qualities that make that leader so important to you. And I'm going to take Lincoln off the stage because it's too easy to arrive there. David, let's begin with you.
Well, then I'll stick with Franklin Roosevelt. And indeed, this is not just my idiosyncratic opinion in most of these regular polls amongst historians, but who have been the greatest presidents. It's usually Lincoln and Roosevelt that top the list. And I think Roosevelt had a lot of the characteristics that we've been discussing here. Vision, courage, compassion, credibility. These were all attributes of his leadership performance. And I do think, it's leadership in a democracy has its own peculiar challenges. Winston Churchill once put it this way. He said, citizens of a democracy want their leaders to keep their ear to the ground, but they find it difficult to look up to a person who has assumed that position. And in his own way, I think Churchill captured something essential. In an egalitarian society, we're reluctant to cede authority and decision-making power to others. So there are peculiar challenges in a democracy, and they have especially to do with these qualities of credibility and compassion and attachment to the public at large if you're a political leader. And I think Roosevelt had those qualities in abundance.
Kavita?
I think the person who inspires me on a daily basis is a woman I met in 1996, soon after I started my job at the Global Fund for Women. The Taliban were in power in Afghanistan. She's a teacher. Her name is Sakina Yaqubi. She was running running schools, beginning to start a school for girls in a refugee camp in Peshawar. So you don't know her name. She's not been on any big broadcasts. She hasn't written a book. But she did run underground schools in Afghanistan during the time of the Taliban. She's an extraordinarily courageous, compassionate woman of great character with an extraordinary degree of pragmatism. She got the leading imam in the refugee camp in Peshawar, which I actually visited, to come and start teaching Quran lessons, and then to bring his wife, and then to bring his daughters. And then everyone in the refugee camp started coming to the classes. Today she runs something called the Afghan Institute of Learning, which reaches over 300,000 students, both boys and girls. And I think of the strength and courage she had at a time when basically everyone was saying to her, you can't do this. It's too dangerous. It's too difficult. Nothing will change in Afghanistan. And she's still doing it. And I wake up every morning and she gives me a lot of hope for why leadership does exist in places you wouldn't expect it.
Congressman?
Tom, as the son of immigrants, first to get a college degree in my family, who didn't know what Stanford looked like until the day my mother and I drove to the campus to start my first day here at the university, I would be remiss if I didn't say my mother and father. But if I want to give you someone that most of you would know, I'd say it's the real Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, who it would be my hero. In a couple of hours, my daughter will hear the words, play ball. She's 10 years old, and I'm not there, but I know my friends who will be there, parents of some of the other kids, will be saying to Natalia and the other teammates, be a hitter. When you get up to the plate, be a hitter. Don't take the walk. If it's coming down the plate, you swing. If you strike out, be a hitter. And I would say that Eleanor Roosevelt made sure that Franklin Roosevelt was a hitter. And President Hennessy said something very important. Some of the best and brightest have decided to come to Stanford and go into teaching. Let's be hitters. Let's reward the way we reward an engineer or a scientist or a member of Congress. But let's also demand of them the high standards it would take to become an engineer or a scientist as well. So we know we have the best and brightest teaching our kids who should become the next member of Congress, scientist, and all the rest. We have a dire situation when it comes to our workers. 159,000 Americans lost their job last month. Today, when we sent a man to the moon, that worker on that assembly line who helped build that rocket knew that he'd get a little less than the CEO of that company. But it was about $1 for that line worker for every $24 the president or CEO of that company got. Today, that line worker will get a dollar in salary, and the CEO in America, the average CEO, will get 430 times more than that line worker will get. Let's reward work, let's be hitters, and reward people who give a great deal of their life. And finally, let's reward those people and institutions who step to the plate. Stanford University recently said, if you make less than $100,000, your children won't pay tuition. We need to have more people who are willing to step up to the plate and be hitters. And if we do that, we're going to find the Roosevelts of the world will come forward.
President Hennessy?
Well, you took Lincoln out, but as people who've been to my office know, that's the president whose picture sits in my office. So I'd pick George Washington after that, and I'd pick him for two reasons. First, his incredible leadership in the very dim early part of the revolution when we came so close to losing, and he had to drag the army to Valley Forge, cross the middle of the river in the dead of night to win what was a major turning point. But then I take the other picture of Washington. The point comes when the war is over, people are ready to anoint him as the new king. And he has the good sense, having had a classical education, he knows the story of Cincinnatus, he knows the right thing is to step back and to go back to Mount Vernon. And that's what made him an incredible leader.
Well, you take Lincoln off the table, the great lawyer, president. Lincoln brought a morality and a decency to the office of the chief executive and to the idea of public service that is exemplary for all time. My own heroes, I won't get into all the personal reasons, my own mother and father who ennobled themselves as character by the sacrifices they made for us. I agree with the president. I think George Washington is underestimated, underrated. Washington did three things. The president indicated, number one, he won the war. I mean, the British ruled the world. The British man of war was like the stealth bomber or something. And Washington was the first president, a general without an army. They said, "Now you're the general." He said, "Thank you very much. Where's the army?" They said, "Well, you go out. You go find the army." And you're right. When he surrenders his sword at Annapolis, this is a visual image of the idea of a separation of powers and subservience to decent people. The second thing he did was to ensure that we had a constitution. We would not have had a constitution or the constitution we have were it not for George Washington. They met in Philadelphia in 1787, and you read the comments from the participants, And the South Carolina delegate stands up and he says, the differences between us are greater than the difference in Russia and Turkey. And at sometimes the delegates said, in effect, in modern parlance, we're out of here. We've had enough of this. But Washington said, gentlemen, please stay. And you didn't walk out on the great man. Washington succeeded in an age which was not celebrity crazed. Washington became the world's greatest celebrity, and he replaced, in that respect, Isaac Newton, who'd been the world celebrity for about 150 years. Isaac Newton symbolized the Enlightenment. People didn't understand Principia Mathematica, but this idea that the apple falls because there's a law, they understood that. And Washington was the poster boy for the American Revolution, which put into play the principle that humankind can discover the laws of good government. And he did that in the Constitutional Convention. The third thing he did is became the first president, and he showed by his decency, by his self-restraint, that the chief executive could be a leader and still acknowledge the voice of the people. Washington was a very good writer. He gets a bad reputation. And he wrote down as a young person the rules that he would be governed by. And one of his rules, I think it was number 122, the final, was keep alive always within your breast that little spark of incandescent fire called conscience. And it's conscience that, in a sense, is a synonym for many of the words we've talked about here today: courage and compassion. And that's your job, President Hennessy, is to teach those who will soon be the trustees of our freedom, the greatness of the past. And for you doing that, in Shakespeare's terms, we can no other answer make but thanks and thanks and ever thanks.
We've had 2 George Washingtons in a row, Carla. You can't go to a 3. You've got to have somebody else.
No, I wasn't going there, but it reminds me, the genius of the Founding Fathers was to believe fundamentally that everyday people could lead and would lead, given the circumstances, in extraordinary ways. They knew that leadership was not about hierarchy or title or position, and they codified that in many ways. So when I'm asked the question, leaders that inspire me, I tend to think about all the leaders I've met that no one's ever heard of. And in particular, I also think about women who have been through extraordinary tragedy, mutilation, abuse, and who yet, with no support, have the courage and the hope to apply themselves to make a better world. With, honestly speaking, with all great respect to our founding fathers and George Washington, it is difficult to lead surrounded by 80 plus of your colleagues. It is so much more difficult to lead when you are alone and afraid and in danger and in pain. And yet I think of this one woman in particular who, having been abused in unimaginable ways, yet applied herself in her war-torn community to go and speak to her tribal elders to try and protect the lives of the innocent children. I think the great promise of the 21st century is that we will have the tools to empower leaders of all kinds in all places, and that we are faced with challenges of such extraordinary complexity and difficulty that we will have to let go once and for all of the notion that you have to look a certain way or be a certain thing or have a certain stature and title in order to lead. Our challenges are so difficult that we need all of the leaders we can get. And finally, for once in human history, we now have the tools where anyone can lead if they choose to step forward. And that is why I think this will be the greatest century in the history of humankind, despite all our great challenges.
Well, Tom, I think presidents are pretty well covered, and I think the importance of women as leaders and growing that is well covered. And so I need to go a little bit counter here. And, you know, certainly, you know, my parents, I've been extraordinarily fortunate to work with a lot of great leaders in industry. But I think I'm the closer, so I'm going to delve into pop culture and pick something in baseball. And it'll be a little symbolic. I've been very fortunate as part of my role with the Seattle Mariners ownership group to get to know people like Lou Piniella. And I'm going to pick Lou Piniella more as symbolic of the collective of some of the things that I've learned from a number of great leaders. Several years ago, I was having dinner with Lou at spring training, and I asked him, what makes a great manager, meaning the coach on the field? I think Lou happens to be one. I wanted to know what his view was. And he said, Jeff, 5 things. He said, number 1, you have to get along with people. He said, in this day and age, the manager on the field is oftentimes making 1/10 the salary of the number 1 player. He said, number 2, Jeff, what you have to do is you have to be able to help your players perform near their peak day in and day out. What is it that he could do to help somebody who's on a roll continue to be on a roll? What is it that he shouldn't do? And how does he help avoid them going into a slump? Number 3, he said, Jeff, PR. I said, Lou. He says, look, Jeff, the players read what I say. If I say the right thing, it sends them in the right direction. If I say the wrong thing, it sends them in the wrong direction. Well, that's interesting. Number 4, game strategy. I said, come on, Lou, game strategy. You know, the average fan thinks you're the guy who, you know, sets up the lineup and makes the pitching changes and so on and so forth. And this is where the Lou Piniella, if you know him, he gets very animated. And he sits forward in his chair and he says, look, I don't field for those guys. I don't hit for those guys. I don't pitch for those guys. They're on the field. They're the ones who have to do that job. Okay. Backed off a little bit. And he said, number 5, getting along with the front office. Those are the people who make the trades and so on and so forth. And I thought about that, and it was at least 6 months before I really figured out that what Lou Piniella had done that evening in that one-on-one conversation was to crystallize for me a lot about great leadership. You know, if you want to be a great leader, you have to have a passion for what you do, and clearly he does. And you have to be willing to hold people accountable as a part of what they do. You have to have the ability to reduce things to their essence and be able to use that as a way to get people to do what you need them to do. You know, the best leaders I've found have the ability to take the complexity of the world and get it focused in on what you need to do. As a great leader, you have to make others great. You have to see that as your role. And you have to be able to collaborate. You have to be able to connect. And so while what Lou Piniella taught me about that night was about being a great baseball manager, really what he taught me about was being a great leader. And when I look around these panelists who also inspire me as a leader, but in particular, when I pick up on Carly's comments. What we really need is to recognize that all of the folks here, all of the students that are coming out of Stanford, if they represent those characters, those characteristics of leadership, those attributes, this world will be a better place. And that's the kind of thing that inspires me, is to see that potential.
If I can invoke a note of personal privilege, I will leave you with my choice. In my adult lifetime, I think we owe an enormous debt to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was killed 40 years ago after liberating this country from racism. Not just black people, but white people as well, with a philosophy of nonviolence, with enormous physical courage, and by using the rule of law. And we are a far better country for it today, and this gathering is much different than it would have been if we'd continued our old ways. Thank you all very much. I think we owe a great debt to our panel that is here.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.